Russian forces continue their grinding advance through Donetsk Oblast. European natural gas prices spike amid an unusually severe winter. Ukrainian artillery crews ration shells as European ammunition production falls months behind schedule. Far-right parties in Germany poll at record highs. Far-left coalitions in France campaign on ending military aid. NATO defense ministers issue quiet warnings that alliance stockpiles are approaching critical thresholds. European economic forecasts are revised downward for the third consecutive quarter. These aren't isolated developments. They're symptoms of a single strategic reality converging on Europe in early 2025. Supporting Ukraine's defense of its eastern territories is becoming fundamentally incompatible with maintaining European stability. This isn't Russian propaganda. It's the assessment emerging from European capitals behind closed doors. Europe committed to principles that seemed unshakable. Borders cannot be changed by force. International law must be defended. Aggression cannot be rewarded. The continent has provided unprecedented support. Hundreds of billions in aid, comprehensive sanctions, military equipment transfers that have depleted national arsenals. These commitments weren't rhetorical gestures. They were backed by tangible sacrifice. But Russia has systematically engineered conditions where upholding these principles now requires Europeans to accept consequences that threaten the continent's own foundations. Declining living standards, political fragmentation, compromised military readiness, and deepening social divisions. Russia has forced a choice Europe never wanted to confront: Ukraine's east or Europe's survival as a stable, prosperous geopolitical entity. To understand how we arrived at this impossible dilemma and why Russia always intended to force exactly this calculation, we need to examine what's actually happening right now. Start with the battlefield. Around Pokrovsk Yar and Kupiansk, Russian forces sustain relentless pressure, forcing Ukrainian defenders to expend artillery shells, armored vehicles, and trained personnel faster than Western supply chains can replace them. Ukrainian commanders now openly acknowledge rationing precision munitions weapons, once considered essential for countering Russian numerical advantages. European ammunition production increases promised throughout 2023 and 2024 remain months behind projected targets. The gap between what Ukraine requires and what Europe can deliver widens weekly, not narrows. This military strain unfolds alongside an energy crisis Europe hoped it had solved. Despite aggressive diversification since 2022, natural gas prices remain volatile, and this winter has proven unusually severe. Storage levels are drawing down faster than anticipated. Russia retains leverage through liquefied natural gas exports that several European nations still purchase, often indirectly through intermediary states. Europe avoided the catastrophic scenarios predicted in 2022, but vulnerability persists beneath the surface calm. Economically, the picture darkens further. Germany, Europe's industrial engine, enters its second consecutive year of recession. France manages fiscal constraints, limiting government flexibility. Italy and Spain navigate elevated debt amid rising interest rates. Layer sanctions-related trade disruptions atop these existing pressures, and growth forecasts continue their downward revisions pattern, now entering its third consecutive quarter. These economic anxieties translate directly into politics. Anti-establishment parties across the continent have transformed skepticism toward Ukraine aid into electoral strategy. This isn't confined to the traditional right/left-wing movements increasingly question military spending while domestic programs face austerity. Polling across Germany, France, Italy, and Slovakia reveals eroding public support for open-ended commitments. Governing coalitions once unified in solidarity now fracture over aid package votes. Beneath these institutional pressures lies something more human: ordinary Europeans experiencing tangible costs. Energy bills remain elevated. Food prices haven't fully normalized. General inflation has quietly eroded purchasing power built over decades. Meanwhile, more than 4 million Ukrainian refugees remain across European nations, creating genuine integration challenges, particularly where housing shortages already strain local resources. None of these pressures exist in isolation. Military strain accelerates political fatigue. Economic hardship amplifies social tension. Energy vulnerability constrains strategic options. Together, they create something more dangerous than any single crisis, a convergence of exhaustion across every domain simultaneously. These simultaneous pressures aren't coincidental. They're the result of a deliberate Russian strategy that's been developing since the war's opening months. February 2022 began with a Russian strategic assumption. Rapid mechanized thrusts toward Kyiv would decapitate Ukrainian government structures, present Europe with a fait accompli, and minimize time for coordinated Western response. Within 3 weeks, that assumption collapsed. Columns stalled outside the capital. Logistics chains broke down. Ukrainian resistance proved far more organized than Moscow anticipated. By late March, Russian forces withdrew from northern Ukraine entirely, a humiliating reversal that forced fundamental strategic recalculation. April 2022 marked the pivot. Russian military leadership recognized they could neither install a puppet regime in Kyiv nor achieve rapid territorial conquest across eastern Ukraine. Rather than abandoning objectives, Moscow shifted toward protracted, multi-dimensional pressure. The Donbas offensive would continue, but it would serve purposes beyond capturing ground. It would force Ukraine to consume ammunition, equipment, and manpower at rates requiring perpetual Western resupply. The strategic question transformed. Not, can Russia defeat Ukraine militarily, but can Europe sustain Ukraine longer than Russia can sustain pressure? This recalibration demanded weaponizing European vulnerabilities systematically. Energy became the first vector. In June 2022, Gazprom reduced gas flows through Nord Stream to 60% of capacity, citing turbine maintenance. By July, flows dropped to 40%. In August, they fell to 20%. On September 2nd, Nord Stream shut completely, officially for repairs, effectively forever. Russia timed this escalation deliberately heading into winter, when European heating demand peaks. The objective wasn't maximizing energy revenue. It was demonstrating that supporting Ukraine would impose measurable costs on European households. Every spiking energy bill became a political pressure point. Simultaneously, Russia positioned itself to absorb sanctions more effectively than European planners anticipated. Pre-war preparations included accumulating substantial foreign currency reserves, over $600 billion, though roughly half would be frozen. Moscow had also developed sanctions evasion infrastructure and deepened trade relationships with China, India, and other non-Western economies willing to purchase Russian exports without political conditions. Meanwhile, European sanctions imposed genuine costs on European economies, disrupted supply chains, lost export markets, expensive trade reorganization, and foregone Russian business relationships built over decades. Information warfare amplified these economic strains. Russian state media and allied social media networks didn't need to fabricate European concerns about inflation, energy costs, or recession risks. They simply amplified legitimate anxieties, linking them consistently to Ukraine's support. Far-right and far-left political movements opposing aid packages received favorable coverage in Russian outlets and algorithmic promotion across platforms Moscow could influence. Russia didn't create European political divisions, but it systematically widened them. Migration added another pressure layer. The 2021 to 2022 Belarus border crisis, where Minsk pushed thousands of Middle Eastern migrants toward Polish and Lithuanian frontiers, established the playbook. Russia's full-scale invasion then triggered Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. Over 4 million Ukrainians dispersed across the continent. While refugees resulted from Russian aggression, Moscow calculated correctly that their presence would eventually strain European social services and fuel political resentment, particularly in nations with existing housing shortages. Each vector served a unified strategic objective, making European support for Ukraine politically unsustainable. Russia didn't need to defeat NATO armies. It needed to convince European voters that defending Ukrainian territory cost more than their societies could bear. The timeline tells the story. Spring 2022 brought initial European unity and sweeping support. Winter 2022 to 2023 delivered the first energy crisis, testing that unity. Throughout 2023, military stalemate continued without decisive breakthrough. By 2024, political fractures widened. Election results and coalition tensions, polling shifts. Now, in early 2025, these accumulated pressures converge. This historical progression reveals that Russia's current strategy isn't improvised desperation. It's a comprehensive campaign designed to exploit fundamental vulnerabilities in European political systems. Russia never needed to defeat NATO militarily or conquer all of Ukraine. Moscow needed to engineer conditions where defending Ukrainian territorial integrity becomes incompatible with maintaining European stability. This is a fundamentally different objective, requiring a fundamentally different strategy, and it's succeeding. The mechanism can be termed a sustainability trap, a scenario where the resources required to achieve stated European objectives exceed the resources European political systems can sustainably provide without triggering internal crisis. Consider the military dimension. European defense industrial bases were designed for peacetime production with surge capacity for limited conflicts, not sustained peer-level combat. Ukrainian artillery crews fire shells at rates comparable to major conventional wars, thousands of rounds daily across multiple sectors. European factories still operate closer to peacetime rhythms. Expanding production requires massive capital investment, specialized workforce development, and multi-year timelines to bring new capacity online. Meanwhile, Russia converted to wartime production in 2022 and 2023, accepting economic distortions authoritarian systems can impose far more easily than democracies navigating labor markets, environmental regulations, and shareholder expectations. This creates an impossible trilemma. Europe can accept gradual Ukrainian military degradation as stockpiles deplete faster than replacements arrive, undermining the stated objective of Ukrainian territorial defense. Europe can transfer equipment from its own arsenals to fill the gap, depleting NATO stockpiles, to levels that compromise the alliance's defensive readiness. Or, Europe can invest hundreds of billions into defense industrial expansion, diverting resources from other priorities and accepting years before results materialize. Each option carries strategic costs. None offers clean solutions. Economic sustainability presents similar contradictions. Supporting Ukraine imposes three simultaneous burdens: direct financial aid for reconstruction budget support and humanitarian assistance, military aid through equipment transfers and ammunition purchases, and sanctions costs, including lost trade, elevated energy prices, and expensive supply chain reorganization. Individually, these burdens might prove manageable for wealthy European economies. Simultaneously, during a period already marked by inflation and anemic growth, they compound into something more dangerous. The electoral mathematics are straightforward. Voters experiencing declining living standards eventually elect governments promising to prioritize domestic concerns over foreign commitments. This isn't moral failure, it's democratic accountability functioning exactly as designed. Russia has engineered economic conditions where supporting Ukraine requires European citizens to accept sustained material sacrifice with no defined endpoint. Ask populations to sacrifice temporarily for clear objectives with visible timelines, and democratic systems can sustain remarkable consensus. Ask them to sacrifice indefinitely for objectives that remain strategically ambiguous, and political cohesion fractures. Political sustainability exposes the deeper asymmetry. Democratic systems require ongoing public consensus for costly policies. Russia's strategy exploits the temporal difference between authoritarian and democratic governance structures. Putin can maintain consistent policy across election cycles, insulated from immediate public pressure. European leaders must renegotiate Ukraine support repeatedly. Every election becomes a referendum on continued commitment. By extending the conflict, Russia maximizes the number of electoral tests where Ukraine policy faces domestic challenge. The current political landscape reveals this trap closing. Germany's governing coalition confronts potential collapse partly over Ukraine-related defense spending amid recession. Macron's reduced parliamentary majority limits France's fiscal flexibility for aid packages. Italy manages coalition partners with diverging Ukraine commitments. Slovakia elected a government explicitly skeptical of continued support. Hungary actively obstructs EU aid mechanisms. These aren't isolated political developments. They're symptoms of the sustainability trap manifesting as electoral consequences. Social sustainability adds the human dimension. European populations face compounding pressures: elevated energy costs, persistent inflation, housing shortages in major cities, strained public services, and integration challenges from over 4 million Ukrainian refugees. Any single pressure is manageable. Combined and sustained across years, they erode social cohesion and fuel political volatility. Russia didn't manufacture these pressures from whole cloth. Many reflect broader global trends: post-pandemic inflation, energy market transitions, demographic aging, infrastructure underinvestment. Russia's strategy is amplification and association, ensuring these existing pressures link directly to Ukraine support in public consciousness, creating mental associations between international solidarity and domestic hardship. This engineering produces the forced choice. Europe can continue supporting Ukraine's eastern territories, but doing so now requires accepting military stockpile depletion that compromises European defense, economic costs that threaten industrial competitiveness and living standards, political instability as anti-establishment parties gain ground, and social fractures that undermine continental cohesion. Alternatively, Europe can prioritize its own stability, but that path requires accepting territorial concessions in Ukraine that legitimize conquest, undermining the rules-based international order Europe claims to defend, demonstrating that Western security commitments have material limits, and potentially emboldening future aggression elsewhere. This isn't a choice Europe wanted to confront. Many European leaders still refuse to acknowledge it publicly, maintaining rhetorical commitments to supporting Ukraine as long as it takes, while avoiding specification of what that actually entails. But refusing to acknowledge the choice doesn't eliminate its avoidance, simply allows circumstances to make the decision by default, likely in directions no European capital would consciously choose. Russia's strategy is designed to ensure that regardless of which option Europe selects, Moscow achieves core strategic objectives: either Ukrainian territorial concessions that validate Russian revisionism, or European destabilization that fractures the coalition capable of supporting sustained resistance. Understanding this forced choice explains why we're seeing specific developments across Europe right now. Developments that reveal the choice is no longer theoretical. European policy is already shifting in ways that reveal the choice being made, even as leaders publicly maintain unwavering commitment to Ukraine. The political manifestations are most visible. Germany's ruling coalition confronts pressures that transcend normal parliamentary friction. Chancellor Scholz's approval ratings have declined to levels that threaten coalition stability, with opposition parties, both traditional conservatives and newer populist movements, gaining ground on platforms explicitly questioning unlimited Ukraine aid. France has quietly adjusted certain commitments, while Macron continues delivering speeches about European solidarity. The gap between rhetoric and resource allocation widens incrementally, almost imperceptibly, but consistently. Italy's government navigates coalition partners with fundamentally different views on military aid packages. Each vote becomes a test of governmental survival, rather than routine policy implementation. Slovakia's recent election produced a government openly skeptical of continued support. Hungary continues wielding veto power over EU aid mechanisms, no longer isolated in opposition, but increasingly representative of broader sentiment. These aren't isolated political events scattered randomly across the continent. They represent a pattern. European governments recalibrating Ukraine commitments in response to domestic electoral pressures. The sustainability trap is manifesting as political consequences that force policy adjustment regardless of strategic preferences. Military realities are shifting simultaneously. NATO defense ministers now discuss the tension between Ukraine aid and alliance readiness with unprecedented candor, at least in closed sessions. Several European militaries have quietly acknowledged that further equipment transfers would compromise their own operational capabilities below acceptable thresholds. Artillery ammunition allocations are being reassessed against dual requirements: Ukrainian battlefield needs and European stockpile preservation. This creates a calculation with no satisfactory solution. If Russia's strategic objective includes degrading European military readiness, and the evidence suggests it does, then depleting European arsenals to supply Ukraine serves Russian interests, even when it helps Ukraine tactically. Support Ukraine and weaken European defense. Preserve European military capacity and watch Ukrainian capabilities degrade. The choice exists whether acknowledged or not. Economic policy reveals similar recalibrations. European governments increasingly prioritize industrial competitiveness and economic growth in ways that occasionally conflict with Ukraine commitments. Energy policy is gradually, almost imperceptibly shifting from punishing Russia toward ensuring European industrial survival. The transition isn't announced through policy reversals, but through quiet adjustments, modest increases in liquefied natural gas purchases from Russian sources through intermediaries, slightly relaxed enforcement of certain sanctions categories, exploratory discussions about potential sanctions relief mechanisms tied to conflict de-escalation. The competitiveness crisis driving these shifts is concrete and measurable. European industries now pay energy costs significantly higher than American or Asian competitors, a gap partly attributable to Ukraine war-related energy market disruptions. This isn't merely an accounting problem. It threatens fundamental European industrial viability across energy-intensive sectors: chemicals, steel manufacturing. Governments face an impossible choice: maintain comprehensive sanctions and accept gradual industrial decline, or prioritize European economic survival and compromise stated Ukraine commitments. Diplomatic messaging is evolving in parallel. European statements increasingly incorporate phrases like realistic peace and sustainable settlement alongside traditional commitments to territorial integrity. These aren't accidental word choices, they're deliberate signaling. Diplomatic channels are quietly exploring what settlement frameworks might resemble, even as public positions maintain maximalist support for Ukrainian objectives. The distance between private diplomatic conversations and public political statements grows wider. This reflects emerging recognition among European policy elites. Ukrainian reconquest of all occupied territories may not be achievable with resources Europe can sustainably provide. That recognition creates pressure to define acceptable outcomes, a phrase that would have been politically toxic in 2022, but now circulates in confidential strategy documents across European capitals. Beyond Europe, other powers are observing carefully. Beijing watches European responses to assess Western resolve and sustainability in prolonged confrontations. Analysis directly relevant to Taiwan scenarios. Authoritarian regimes globally are drawing lessons not about Western weakness, but about Western limitations. Democratic systems can mobilize impressive resources rapidly, but sustaining costly commitments across multiple election cycles proves extraordinarily difficult. Western security guarantees have temporal boundaries determined by domestic politics rather than strategic logic. The institutional implications may prove most consequential long-term. This crisis reveals fundamental tensions within European integration that decades of economic cooperation successfully avoided. European Union mechanisms designed for trade policy, regulatory harmonization, and economic coordination now strain under geopolitical pressures, requiring sustained national sacrifice with unequal burden distribution. NATO cohesion faces unprecedented stress from diverging threat perceptions. Eastern members view Russian aggression as existential threat, while Southern and Western members increasingly frame it as manageable regional conflict and vastly unequal capability contributions. These aren't abstract institutional challenges for future academic analysis. They're active fractures reshaping European strategic posture right now, in early 2025, as the sustainability trap closes. These observable shifts are creating several possible futures, and the path Europe takes will reshape the international order for decades. Europe's current position is unsustainable. Rhetorically committed to Ukrainian victory, While practically struggling to provide necessary resources, European policy exists in contradiction that cannot persist indefinitely. The sustainability trap will force resolution through one of several pathways. Scenario 1. Escalatory breakthrough. Europe makes a fundamental strategic decision to prioritize Ukrainian victory over near-term costs. This requires massive mobilization of defense industrial capacity comparable to wartime production, not incremental increases, but transformational expansion. It demands acceptance of sustained economic sacrifice codified in multi-year budget commitments that survive electoral transitions. It requires political leaders willing to campaign explicitly on Ukraine support, despite electoral risks, framing the conflict as existential for European security rather than distant humanitarian concern. It potentially involves direct NATO involvement in specific support capacities, air defense over Western Ukraine, logistics coordination, intelligence and reconnaissance sharing that crosses current red lines. What this achieves is substantial. Ukraine receives resources necessary to potentially accomplish significant territorial recovery. The West demonstrates credible long-term commitment that reestablishes deterrence against future aggression. The principle that borders cannot be changed by force, the foundation of post-1945 European order, is preserved through material sacrifice rather than abandoned through exhaustion. The costs are equally substantial. This path requires political will that current European electoral dynamics suggest is diminishing rather than growing. It demands economic sacrifices during an existing cost of living crisis, asking populations already strained by inflation to accept further material hardship. It risks escalation with a nuclear-armed power. Timeline realities are unforgiving. Industrial mobilization requires years, meaning Ukrainian military position could degrade significantly before increased production materializes. Probability assessment. Low given current political trajectories unless a catalyzing event dramatically shifts European public opinion in ways that override economic concerns. Scenario 2. Managed decline towards settlement. Europe gradually reduces ambitions for Ukrainian territorial recovery while maintaining sufficient support to prevent outright Ukrainian collapse. This represents the path current European policy trends are moving toward almost imperceptibly but consistently. The progression is predictable. Continued ammunition and equipment aid, but at levels insufficient for major Ukrainian offensive operations. Diplomatic messaging evolves further toward sustainable peace and realistic settlement frameworks. Quiet diplomatic pressure on Kyiv to consider territorial compromises in exchange for security guarantees/pressure, never delivered publicly, but communicated through aid conditionality and private conversations. Eventually, a negotiated settlement emerges that freezes the conflict along approximate current lines, perhaps with minor adjustments. This pathway avoids worst-case scenarios. Ukraine doesn't collapse entirely. Europe doesn't commit to indefinite economic strain. But it legitimizes territorial conquest, fundamentally undermining international law principles Europe claims to defend. It leaves critical security questions unresolved. What prevents Russia from resuming operations after reconstituting forces? Any settlement requires credible security architecture for remaining Ukrainian territory, likely involving some form of NATO involvement short of formal membership, creating ambiguities that could prove destabilizing. Likelihood assessment, high. This represents the path of least resistance for European governments facing domestic political pressures. Leaders can claim they supported Ukraine substantially while avoiding open-ended commitment. The primary risk is that Russia, sensing European exhaustion, rejects reasonable settlement terms and calculates that continued pressure will extract further concessions. Scenario 3. European fracture. The sustainability trap breaks European cohesion entirely. Different member states adopt fundamentally incompatible Ukraine policies. Poland, Baltic states, and potentially Nordic countries maintain strong support, viewing Russian aggression as existential threat requiring sustained resistance. Hungary, Slovakia, and potentially Germany or Italy under new governments reduce or eliminate aid, prioritizing domestic economic concerns and bilateral relationships with Russia. The trajectory becomes self-reinforcing. EU and NATO mechanisms strain as member states cannot reach consensus on coordinated policy. Aid to Ukraine becomes bilateral rather than institutional, reducing efficiency and strategic coherence. Ukrainian military position degrades as overall European support declines, despite some states maintaining robust assistance. Russia exploits divisions systematically, potentially offering differentiated settlement terms to different European states, further fragmenting unified response. The consequences extend far beyond Ukraine. This represents catastrophic failure for European integration as geopolitical project. It undermines the EU as coherent international actor and NATO as effective alliance. It creates long-term European security vulnerabilities that transcend Ukraine specifically. A fractured Europe becomes target for future pressure campaigns across multiple domains. Likelihood assessment. Moderate to high if current trajectories continue without coordinated intervention. The sustainability trap is designed specifically to produce exactly this outcome. Scenario 4. External shock. A dramatic event fundamentally resets European political calculations. Possibilities include Russian military breakthrough threatening Western Ukraine and creating humanitarian catastrophe visible across European media. Ukrainian breakthrough offensive that changes battlefield dynamics and renews hope for territorial recovery. Russian nuclear threats escalating to levels that force immediate NATO response decisions. Or conflict expansion beyond Ukraine that directly threatens NATO territory. External shocks are inherently unpredictable, but historically common in protracted conflicts. Stalemates rarely persist indefinitely. They break, sometimes catastrophically. Russia might escalate if it perceives European resolve finally collapsing. Ukraine might achieve localized breakthrough if ammunition supplies temporarily surge. The current stability is fragile, not permanent. Such shocks could consolidate European commitment or trigger complete collapse depending on specifics. The direction is uncertain, but the possibility demands acknowledgement. Strategic reality. These scenarios aren't equally probable, nor are they mutually exclusive. Elements may combine in unexpected configurations. Current European policy trends suggest movement towards Scenario 2, unless political dynamics shift substantially. Scenario 3 becomes progressively more likely the longer the sustainability trap persists without resolution. Whichever path Europe takes, by choice or by default, the decision will reveal fundamental truths about European power cohesion and resilience. Russia forced Europe to choose between Ukraine's east and its own survival. This wasn't metaphor or rhetorical exaggeration. It's the strategic reality emerging from converging military, economic, political, and social pressures that make indefinite support for Ukrainian territorial integrity increasingly incompatible with European stability. The choice is being made right now in early 2025 through thousands of individual decisions by European governments, voters, and institutions. Every ammunition shipment delayed by budget negotiations. Every political party gaining ground on platforms opposing aid. Every quiet diplomatic conversation exploring settlement frameworks. Every household struggling with energy bills and connecting that hardship to distant conflict. These aren't preparations for a future decision. They are the decision, manifesting incrementally rather than announced dramatically through a single policy reversal. Russia engineered this dilemma with systematic precision. The grinding Eastern offensive that forces continuous Ukrainian resource consumption. The energy market manipulation that ties European heating costs to geopolitical solidarity. The amplification of political divisions that transforms legitimate democratic debate into strategic vulnerability. The economic pressure that makes supporting Ukraine measurably expensive for ordinary citizens. Each component was designed to make defending Ukrainian territory progressively more costly, until European political systems could no longer sustain the burden. The strategy didn't require defeating NATO militarily or conquering all of Ukraine. It required creating conditions where European democracies would make the choice Moscow desired, while believing it was their own decision based on their own interests. What's at stake extends far beyond Ukrainian territorial integrity or European rhetorical commitment to international law. This is a test of whether European democracies can sustain costly commitments when confronted by authoritarian systems willing to accept prolonged sacrifice. Whether European integration can survive serious geopolitical stress that requires unequal burden sharing and sustained public hardship. Whether the lessons China draws about Taiwan or Iran about regional ambitions, or other revisionist powers about challenging Western-led order, will be that democratic resolve has temporal limits, determined by election cycles, rather than strategic necessity. The choice between Ukraine's East and European survival reveals an uncomfortable truth about contemporary European power. Europe possesses enormous economic resources, technological sophistication, and institutional frameworks built over decades. But converting these structural advantages into sustained strategic action when it requires population sacrifice proves extraordinarily difficult for democratic systems navigating peacetime transitions to prolonged conflict. Russia understood this vulnerability better than Europe understood itself. That asymmetry in strategic self-awareness may prove more decisive than any battlefield development. Because Russia's greatest strategic achievement wasn't advancing in Donetsk, it was convincing Europe that supporting Ukraine threatened European survival, transforming allies into adversaries of their own stated principles.